Hello. Welcome to the Enris Files. Thoughts on pop culture, history, and the human condition from a very specific Generation X point of view. Today's show is going to be a little bit different from the shows that have come before, although if all goes well, it will hopefully resemble shows that are going to be coming down the line. I had a show that one of the live streams was never actually broadcast by YouTube, and the reason I suspect was because in the description for that live stream, I had included vocabulary that was probably picked up by the algorithm. The algorithm always has to be referred to in very hushed tones. It may have been picked up as by the algorithm as being something that YouTube does not necessarily want to rebroadcast on their platform. I don't know. But let this serve as a content warning. I am going to be talking about the consequences of violence. I am not going to be emphasizing the violence itself. However, if you find discussion of such topics to elicit a negative response in yourself, then you may want to consider not listening any further. The violence I'm going to be discussing can be of a personal nature, and it can also be of a broader nature, like when it comes to warfare or when it comes to other pursuits of political aims. I want to start my conversation with the very personal consequences that result from personal misbehavior, and why a path to forgiveness needs to be available in a society in order for the society to move forward and to advance, and also in order to advance the cause of behaving correctly, make compliance easier than defiance. And no, I'm not one of those rhyming attorneys, but this is a phrase that has occurred to me. I want to start by talking about the Me Too movement. By the way, I will note that I have my notes here in front of me because since I am talking about some matters that did happen historically, relatively recently, and there are some court cases involved, I want to try to get the details as correct as I am able to. If you are aware of any mistakes that I've made, or if you wish to elaborate, feel free to do so in the comments section on whatever platform you're watching this. The Me Too movement, for those of you who may not remember, started in 2017 as a confluence of events that brought to light and brought into the public imagination the problem of sexual harassment in the workplace, and in particular in the entertainment industry, but not exclusively in the entertainment industry. And the movement, by and large, shone a spotlight on something that I think we can agree is a problem, but it also had some unintended consequences that I think could also agree were not necessarily desirable. But as with everything, its net effect is complicated. It's not as straightforward as being all good or all bad. This confluence of events that came to a head toward the end of 2017 start with Bill Cosby. And I need to mention that a lot of this is a personal story for me because I hosted a weekly radio comedy show where we would play stand-up routines and we would play comedy music, parody music, that kind of thing. We would play sketches and skits, something one of my co-producers referred to as skitches anyway, whatever. Bill Cosby was frequently played on our show, both by me and other hosts on the show. Bill Cosby was an expert at telling humorous stories in such a way that it would elicit laughter from the audience very effectively. And And if you wanted to study how to deliver that kind of comic routine, you could do worse than to study Bill Cosby. However, that's on a professional level what he was able to do with regard to comedy. He was very skilled at it. He was, however, also not a very good person, it would appear. Allegations started as far back as 1965 of misbehavior by Bill Cosby. I'm not going to elaborate on the details here. However, the allegations would come up and then they would go away. Every once in a while there would be a lawsuit, and then that lawsuit would get settled. And this included a lawsuit in 2005 that will become important later. But a comedian named Hannibal Buress, in 2014, his routine included a bit about misbehavior amongst his comedic peers. And he called out Bill Cosby by name. And he challenged the audience, if you haven't heard of this, go ahead and look it up on the internet when you get home. Now, this particular routine of his that he performed on many occasions did not end up, that I am aware of, it didn't end up being recorded and presented on any of the streaming services. However, in one of his performances, somebody in the audience had recorded it using, I think, like a cell phone camera or something like that. You can tell the quality of the video is not very high. Listening to it, it's very echoey. Nonetheless, you can very clearly make out both his routine and the response coming from the audience. And this went viral. I think part of why it went viral was because he did challenge the audience. If you don't believe me, if you don't think that what I'm saying is a thing, look it up on the internet. Well, this clip made it to the internet and people looked it up. And so this started to bubble to the surface in 2014. And then in 2015, depositions from Bill Cosby and others were released from the 2005 civil lawsuit. And those depositions were really very damning. And the public attention was very much awakened to the problem of and the problematic behavior of Bill Cosby, the man. In 2018, he was convicted of 3 counts of criminally inappropriate behavior. The convictions were eventually overturned in 2021 on a technicality. And the technicality had to do with a plea deal from those depositions that had been recorded in 2005. Those depositions were supposed to remain sealed as a result of this plea deal, and because they ended up being released anyway, it was ruled to be inadmissible in a criminal suit, and therefore the conviction was thrown out. However, I think it would be fair to say the punishment was handed out. Not only did it bring an end to his career, and granted, he was already an old man by the time he was incarcerated, and he did serve several years of incarceration as an old man. By the time he was released, his career was well and truly done. A lot of his revenue streams had dried up because people, like hosts of comedy shows, weren't playing his material anymore, so he wasn't receiving royalties from them. And he continued to be sued in civil cases. Civil lawsuits, the burden of proof is a little bit lower than in criminal cases. And this is why civil cases sometimes end up meting out the justice that you don't get always from a criminal case, where the threshold is much higher in terms of what is acceptable as evidence. So I think it's fair to say, whether you think it was enough, I am not competent to argue, but I will say he did ultimately suffer some consequences as a result of his bad behavior. Whether it was enough or not is beyond the scope of this conversation. There was also, at around the same time, an issue surrounding another infamous character named Harvey Weinstein. Weinstein. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. He was a very well-known movie producer, and you can even hear references to him in some of the stand-up routines offered by hosts of award shows. He was notorious for misbehavior, criminal misbehavior, but he had never really been called out on it in such a way that he would ever have been prosecuted until 2017. In October of 2017, there were two investigative reports that were released, one by the New York Times and one by the New Yorker magazine. I think that one was written by Rowan Darrow, and he's famous for other reasons, including his famous adoptive father, Woody Allen, who himself has been publicly accused of inappropriate behavior. Harvey Weinstein, as the story broke in October of 2017, people who were cited in those articles included famous actors like Angelina Jolie, Ashley Judd, Gwyneth Paltrow, and Rose McGowan. And this led to a series of criminal cases. He was convicted in 2020 in a New York court, and then there he was sentenced to 23 years in prison. He was also convicted in 2022 in a court in Los Angeles. Let's take a moment to talk about the Me Too movement in general. It flushed out a lot of bad behavior. As these allegations came to light and people started to take it seriously, a lot of people who really needed to be called out for absolutely behaving terribly, it came to light and it was discussed within the body politic. It was discussed at dinner tables where people acknowledged this kind of behavior happens in traditional offices. This kind of behavior occurs in all kinds of settings where it is inappropriate, and it is inappropriate, and it must not happen. At the same time, some innocent people were also scooped up in the process. I happen to know one individual directly who was publicly and falsely accused of misbehavior, and in his particular case, everything that he had been accused of, there was a ton of documentation to establish that what he had been accused of was in fact false. He did end up winning his civil suit to defend his good name. However, some of the damage had already been done. His career had certainly taken a hit as a result of these false allegations. That is his story to tell, and you know what? Actually, and he worked in journalism, which is why this is such a well documented story, and why the allegations were as well documented as they were, and as was the evidence exonerating him. I'm gonna look up the links, and I'll put those in the description, especially if anybody has interest in that. But I use that as an example. The Me Too movement, like many movements, did an awful lot of good, but at the same time also raised some thorny issues. There's the tension between one phrase that was circulating at the time, believe all women. Understand the Me Too movement was largely seen as an issue where women tended to be on the receiving end and men tended to be on the perpetrating end of these criminal acts. And so as a result, you had phrases going around like, believe all women, when it might have been more appropriate to say, take all accusations seriously. Again, this is a topic that can be and should be debated, and it should be discussed in as many public forums as appropriate. if your slogan can fit on a bumper sticker, it's probably just a little bit too simple or too much oversimplifying the situation in this Generation Xers point of view. And it also raises some other thorny issues about being innocent until proven guilty when a crime is notoriously difficult to prosecute. And the kind of violence involved in these cases is notoriously difficult to prosecute for a number of reasons. So while assuming all allegations in this case are true is problematic, so you still have to acknowledge that that the burden of proof needs to be adjusted so that it is more so that it's easier to prosecute allegations instead of letting too many people who are guilty of these crimes go free. It's a thorny issue, and it is the subject of another video probably done by somebody who is more skilled at talking about this particular topic than I am. This is not the focus of my talk, right? The Me Too movement itself is not the issue. The release valve is what I want to talk about, and this is what I'm leading up to. I mentioned a couple of the most famous cases. There was another famous case that came out also at the same time. This was also late in 2017 when Kevin Spacey was accused by over a dozen men of inappropriate behavior toward them. And he was prosecuted both in criminal and civil court. He was acquitted of criminal charges in the United Kingdom in 2023, and he was also found not liable in a civil suit that was filed by in 2022 in the United States by the same person who was the alleged victim in this case, in the criminal case. Other charges had also been brought against Kevin Spacey, and they were ultimately dropped, including one such charge in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts here in the United States. However, this had a profound impact on his career. He was, at the time, the star of a very successful television series on Netflix called House of Cards, and his involvement with that show came to a very abrupt end because of the nature of these allegations, and other projects that he had been committed to were canceled. One of the more interesting cases was he was also the star of he had a very prominent role in a movie that was going to be coming out later that year called All the Money in the World. This is a movie that was based on a true story, and although he wasn't the protagonist, he was a major character in this movie, and the allegations surfaced in... Wait a minute, I've got my notes here. Let me check my notes. The allegations surfaced in November. The decision was made in November to excise him from the movie. The role was very important, though, so they found another actor who was similarly talented to play the role, and the decision had been made in November of 2017 for a movie that was set to release in December of 2017. They had roughly 5 weeks to get all of this put together, and they did, and they executed it, and the movie did well, which is great news, because the other people involved in the project, and most movies and television shows and other forms of entertainment involve a collaborative work. And I think it is fair to say it's not fair to punish the other participants in the making of this movie for the bad behavior or the alleged bad behavior of one of the members of the cast. I have to be careful when I talk about Kevin Spacey because he was acquitted and he has never been found, or he has not been found liable in the prominent cases of which I am aware. Nonetheless, I think the court of public opinion has a dim view of Mr. Spacey. And this brings me to the last most pertinent example that I want to bring up, and this is another stand-up comedian named Louis C.K. Louis C.K., like others, including Bill Cosby, Louis C.K. had a very successful stand-up career, and then he parlayed that into a very successful career in television, and also a little bit of a career in movies as well. He had also been very, very responsible for the launching of several careers of fellow comedians who were both coming up in the ranks at the same time as he was, and also some who were coming up in the ranks after him, or maybe we could say, behind him on the road to success. He helped a lot of people along, including several prominent women who have become very prominent in the entertainment industry, either as performers or as writers, directors, and producers. So his case is very complicated. In November of 2017, he addressed allegations from 5 women that he had exposed himself to them without their consent. And he did something unlike any of the other men that I have mentioned so far. He admitted his guilt. This is a big deal. He had issued an apology, and again, this is in November of 2017. So this is at the same time that the same thing is happening with all of the other men I have mentioned, plus many other besides. He issued an apology, and here's the thing about his apology. I think it included everything that a good apology is supposed to include. He admitted wrongdoing. He specified what exactly it was that he had done that was wrong. He acknowledged that what he did was wrong and why it was wrong. He offered penance, including giving up millions of dollars in contracts that were outstanding. And I want to come back to that in just a moment. And he promised to reform himself. He promised to behave better in the future. He promised to sit back and listen for a spell and try to learn from what he had done wrong and try to learn how best to atone for his transgressions. This makes him a very different case from the others. I said I was going to come back to the giving up millions of dollars in contracts. This included, by the way, scuttling a movie that of his that he had written and produced. I can't remember if he directed. He may have, but he definitely performed in it. And a lot of other actors performed in it. And although they did all get their paychecks for performing, the movie itself never saw the light of day. And he gave up a lot of other contracts as well. One could argue he was going to lose those contracts anyway because he had become a liability in the court of public opinion. Nonetheless, he started staging a modest comeback about a year after he pulled out. And here's the thing. He started staging his comeback by doing modest stand-up shows in small comedy venues in New York City, which is where he had gotten his start. His initial appearances were not, they were not advertised beforehand. It was like, a special guest who then all of a sudden shows up. In most cases, he tended to be welcomed at these venues, but obviously a couple of people did take exception. They recorded his routine, and then they came out and they reported, "Hey, Louis C.K. is working again," and then released snippets of those recordings. And I have opinions about this, as do we all. His argument was he still had bills to pay, and he still had to provide for his 2 daughters. He and his ex-wife, they were divorced, but he still had to, he had to provide for his daughters. I have no idea if he also had to provide for his ex-wife, but nonetheless, the financial burden was still on him, and he had to make money in order to fulfill those obligations. So this was one of his justifications for why he started to stage his comeback. As word got out and clips of his performances were circulated, I definitely, as somebody who was monitoring the situation, felt that a lot of those clips were deliberately selected to try to make him look bad by saying, look, he's making light of this situation, or he's mocking that situation. I think one of the most egregious examples was there was a part of one of his routines where he talked about the survivors of a tragedy that had happened in Parkland. And again, I don't want to go too much into detail about that one because I would end up using vocabulary that YouTube might not want to have on their platform. If you're not familiar with what happened at Parkland, just look it up, Parkland, one word. And there were many survivors, children who were survivors of this particular episode. And he talked about how those children were addressing Congress and who were essentially touring and talking about their experiences when, he contended, what they should have been doing is enjoying life and doing the things that kids that age do. He was absolutely, while it was part of a comedy set, he was drawing attention to something that was absolutely a tragedy and absolutely worthy of our attention. Some people took clips from that and said, oh, look, he's mocking the survivors of the Parkland incident. And if you listen to the whole routine, he wasn't. In fact, if you listen to the whole routine, you hear him essentially trying to atone for his previous misbehavior. And it's very clear when he talked about the survivors of the Parkland incident. He's a father of two daughters who were of the same age as the students at that particular school, and it's very clear where his sympathies lie. Just a week ago, and here's the interesting thing: when I first did the live stream on this topic, it was 2 weeks ago. 1 week ago, so this is new information since then, Netflix announced that they are going to be presenting a new comedy stand-up special featuring Louis C.K. I think it is fair to say that his comeback tour is continuing to proceed, and he is finding some traction with regard to his stand-up career. I will also say he continues to admit what he did, and he continues to insist that what he did was wrong. He continues to publicly talk about why what he did was wrong and why people shouldn't do it. And I think that is very, very important to consider. The problem when society does not offer a path to forgiveness is that there's no incentive for correction. There's nothing to be gained by admitting guilt. There's nothing to be gained by acknowledging that what you did was wrong. There's everything to be gained by just doubling down. And we have seen this happen in our political system, where some people have admitted to the crimes that they did and they remove themselves from public life and they do whatever else it is they need to do. But there are many who don't, and we see them continue to move up in public life, even though it is clear that the allegations against them are very, very serious. They double down on the behavior. They don't just deny that it happened. They say, and even if it did, it's not that bad. And we have elected people to high office who have been guilty of doubling down on bad behavior. This is why I think a path to forgiveness has to be embraced by society. There has to be a method for atoning. I don't know how to set what the rules of engagement would be there. But I think it is something we need to talk about, and is something we need to acknowledge, because when we insist on there can be no forgiveness, we end up with the sort of political situation that we are experiencing in the United States here in the year 2026, and the several years leading up to this. And I imagine it's going to be a little bit of time before we figure our way out of this. There's another issue surrounding how we manage our response to bad behavior. When it comes to collaborative works, we can often find ourselves in a situation where we're not just punishing the person who has been accused of bad behavior or convicted of bad behavior. We're also punishing innocent people around them who had nothing to do with it. And a good example would be all of the other actors and writers and directors on the Bill Cosby show. Now, I'm not saying that that what Bill Cosby did should not be kept in mind, and I'm not saying that anybody should be forced to watch the Bill Cosby show just because we want to honor the work and the royalty statements of the people who worked with him. But it is something that we need to consider. And this was an interesting situation with regard to the show House of Cards. All of the other people who were working on that show, including the writers and the actors and all that, people whose livelihood was based upon continuing to work, it made sense to continue the show even though they had to lose their one of their lead actors because of his alleged bad behavior. What do you do? What do you do in the case where the perpetrator, and again, he was convicted, Harvey Weinstein, was convicted of bad behavior, but what do you do about the movies that he produced? A lot of people talked about pulling the movies that were produced by the company, the Weinstein brothers, and yet this would have ended up further punishing the people who had already been the victims of his bad behavior. One of the most prominent examples I can think of is Uma Thurman, who was public about how she had been mistreated by Harvey Weinstein, and also how she had been treated well by the director of the Kill Bill movies that she was a star of. People talked about not allowing those the movies that were still in the can to be released in theaters. And ultimately, the decision was, no, they would be released in theaters, but they were going to change the name of the production company to take the Weinstein name out of it, and they renamed it Miramax. And we didn't end up punishing people like Uma Thurman and depriving her of her royalties when she was already a victim of Harvey Weinstein and was instrumental in bringing his case to light with her public description of how she had been mistreated. So I think these are things we need to keep in mind as well. As somebody who was producing the comedy show, yeah, I have to say I would not play Bill Cosby after I heard those allegations. I certainly would never play them again after his conviction. But when you have over 50 allegations, you really have to take those seriously. I don't think I would be able to play his material, even if he had been exonerated, which he wasn't. Likewise, if I ran a television station and the Bill Cosby show was available for us to acquire in syndication, don't think I would do it. Nonetheless, these are things to keep in mind. Harvey Weinstein did not appear in the movies that he produced, and he did not benefit financially from the movies he produced, because from the point of his conviction on, any of the royalties, any of the stake that he had in any of those movies were redirected away from him. So, things to keep in mind. But we still come back to I think that when society does need to offer a path to forgiveness, this does not mean the victims of bad behavior need to offer personal forgiveness. And I need to stress that as well. Society needs a path to allow for people to reform themselves, to pay for what they did, and then to move on, to rebuild their lives. That does not mean the victims have to forgive them. It means society needs to provide that path to atonement if the person does the work to earn that atonement. But yeah, it would be definitely going a bridge too far to insist that somebody who was a victim of that behavior accept that everything's forgiven. I realize I just repeated myself on that point several times, and I repeated it because it's the thesis of this entire talk today, and I think it's important. I think we make society better if we think about and act on these issues. But what actually kicked me into gear to talk about these issues wasn't on that small personal scale of personal bad behavior, but bad behavior on a larger scale, a much larger scale. And I want to talk about how recently a very high up military leader had said that that the military that he was responsible for in prosecuting an invasion or a war against another nation, that his army would offer no quarter to the nation that the military was fighting against. As somebody who has studied history as much as I have, and international relations, and strategic studies, I found this idea to be not just abhorrent and reprehensible, but also and illegal and immoral. And we have to acknowledge that's illegal. It's a war crime, and it is immoral. But it is also bad strategy. It is terrible strategy. And history tells us why. I want to give a few examples. The United States had engaged in a war in the Middle East called Operation Desert Storm. In Desert Storm, the United States led an effort by the United Nations to push Iraqi forces out of the nation of Kuwait. Iraq had invaded Kuwait with the intention of taking their resources and essentially absorbing Kuwait into the larger nation. And the United States, acting on behalf of the United Nations, led the military operation to repel the Iraqi forces. One of the interesting things, though, the attempt to liberate Kuwait went very quickly and very successfully. So successfully that that American commanders had to do some real quick deciding about how far they should go, because the mission objectives had been achieved very early in the campaign. One of the reasons those objectives were acquired and attained so early was because the United States was known for treating prisoners of war humanely, whereas Iraq was not known for treating not only prisoners of war, but their own people humanely. So members of the Iraqi Royal Guard essentially surrendered. They collapsed. And they would rather be taken by U.S. forces than continue to fight on behalf of Iraq. That is one example of how treating your adversary with humane respect is strategically a good move. Not just moral, which it is, and legal, which it is, but also good strategy. I want to give another example. Actually, I'm going to give a couple of examples. And this is important. And by the way, when I say no quarter, this is where, in my description, the first time I had talked about this topic, because I stated very explicitly what the no quarter means. Essentially, it means you're not going to take prisoners. That as your army advances, anybody who falls underfoot is not going to have the opportunity to surrender, and all that implies. This is why the policy of no quarter is illegal by international treaty. It is also against the law of war manual issued by the United States Department of Defense. It is explicitly called out in the Uniform Code of Military Justice. So it's illegal, but it's also bad strategy. Another example would be when Germany prosecuted the Second World War. When they swept through Western Europe, they did find a lot of resistance. However, the resistance was easy enough for them to overcome because while they were obviously not nice people, and their war aims were certainly far from benevolent, they did not destroy everything in their path. In fact, some of the defenders did more damage to their own territory than the Germans did, because they were trying to slow down the advance of the Germans by destroying their own infrastructure, and which, by the way, is not a bad strategy. In this case, it didn't work. However, when the Germans decided to open up their eastern front and pursue invading the Soviet Union, that didn't go so well because they did not take prisoners. And word spread, right? Because people escape. People, as the war moves forward, people are able to get through the battle lines and report back on what they were seeing, what they were experiencing. And as word got out that the Germans were very, very badly mistreating the armed forces that were defending the Soviet Union, the people, the civilians as well as the soldiers in the territories that Germany was trying to take over, were fighting for their very lives. There was nowhere for them to retreat to because Stalin made it clear that he was not going to allow them to retreat. And they knew that surrender was not an option because giving up meant essentially giving up everything. So they resisted. And this is why Germany had such a very difficult time pursuing the war on their Eastern Front. Those are two examples. I need to bring up the most recent example before the statement that led me to talk about this topic. And that is when Russia invaded Ukraine in, I've got it written down here, February of 2022. They said they were going in to liberate the Russians, the ethnic Russians who lived in a particular region within Ukraine. But instead, as they advanced, they very, very badly mistreated both the civilians as well as the military forces who fell under their sway. And as word of that got out, I know a lot of people, by the way, I have a lot of friends who are Russian. I have a lot of friends who are Ukrainian. And of the friends of mine who are Russian, of those who believed in the cause, they took Putin's position that the whole point of the law was to liberate, or not the law, the point of the war was to liberate ethnic Russians who were being mistreated in Ukraine, which, by the way, they may well have been. Again, this isn't the main topic here, but however justified the invasion was, the behavior of the invasion, some of my friends weren't aware of that, and they're like, why would they resist? Why would they fight? They should just welcome the Russian troops. Well, welcoming the Russian troops wasn't a good policy, because anybody who ended up behind enemy lines, or behind Russian lines in this case, was going to end up being very, very badly mistreated. Again, if I were to specify the crimes that were committed, this video could find itself disappeared just like its predecessor. So, Russia expected this to be a very quick win, and I suspect that actually if they had treated the people better who they captured, whether soldiers or civilians, if they had treated them better, they may well have ended their campaign by now, but they didn't. They treated them very poorly. The resistance got really, really galvanized. And then the harder Russia tried to push through, the more other countries offered their support in terms of materiel to Ukraine to push back the invasion. To the point where, as I record this in April of 2026, yes, I was just looking at the date on my screen, this war is still ongoing. It should have been over within a couple of months. Russia's previous invasion of Ukraine to take the Crimean Peninsula, that campaign was actually relatively swift compared to this one, which is still going on after 4 years, more than 4 years. So this is why no quarter is just bad strategy, in addition to being illegal and immoral and a war crime. And I think this is important for people to understand, because when you hear your military leaders speak with all the bravado of, we're not going to take any prisoners, you may respond favorably to the bravado, but it is bad. It is not just illegal. It is bad. It's ill-advised. And I think that it's incumbent upon any society, when their leadership starts advocating for war crimes, that society has to seriously rethink its priorities. Foreign policy is an extension of the political aims of a given government, and the ability to pursue war is just one aspect of foreign policy. The United States has built up an awful lot of advantages in the global system by becoming very good at negotiating, and by becoming very good at maintaining a military that acts as a deterrent to misbehavior rather than as an expenditure. And so I throw that out there as food for thought, having studied this and having some strong opinions about it. What are your opinions? And what are counterexamples? If you disagree with me, what other examples do you think shore up my case? I'd very much love to hear about it. If you look in the description for this video, you will find, first of all, not only can you carry on the conversation in the comments section, you can also visit my community that I have the link to in the description. And of course, you can also give me, you can sign up for a one-on-one call if you would like to talk about storytelling, stories, and strategies. Thank you very much for your very kind attention, and I look forward to talking with you again on the next installment of the Enris Files. Take care.